Kyle Desrosiers-Levine, journalist who covered religion in Middle East and North America. He's into art and culture lifestyle. Kyle worked as a religion reporter at News Service and America Magazine at the time of Israel. Kyle was raised in Texas. He also studied Catholic theology at Boston College, and also Kyle loves religion and spirituality. We have also here Vincent Downing from Board of Director of Brooklyn Society for Ethical Culture too as well. And we have a list of questions for Kyle. Would like to say hi, Kyle, first of all.
Hey, it's great to be here with you and to, get to be on your show. I really appreciated getting to check out some of your episodes, and, I think what you're doing is so important. And, I think as a religious person, as people who are not religious, secular humanists of any kind, I think we all have so much in common, and, I think it's great to just explore ideas together. So it's just such an awesome opportunity as well.
Nice. Kyle is gay and married, who later converted to Orthodox Judaism. Would like to ask you, Kyle, about what is the Enlightenment?
Yeah. So it's a big topic, as you might guess. So, if you're looking at the Enlightenment, I would say, you're really starting around the end of the 17th and into the 18th century. Although even before that, you might draw an origin to the Renaissance, to even back to the Greek philosophers. But really, the idea of the Enlightenment, to keep it simple, is that, there are several values that are tremendously important in the Enlightenment. That would be reason, that would be, personal freedom, that would be equality, and rationality. Now, those ideas can be sort of interpreted in different ways, but the idea of the Enlightenment was that it was almost like a shaking off of the husk of institutions, such as the church in particular, given the European context it came from. And that in the Enlightenment, individuals, rather than a collective society sort of under the rule of an authoritarian despot, individuals would sort of have the agency to rationally make decisions about what's right and wrong, as well as have the freedom to believe and associate as they chose. Now, I don't think it's accurate to say that the liberal democracy that we have now, is what the Enlightenment thinkers were envisioning, nor do I think that the early Enlightenment thinkers really wanted equality like we understand it now, but they definitely planted the seeds that would later, lead to revolutions that would develop into liberal democracies we see now, and of course, religious movements all across the spectrum, as well as critiques against, religion and authority that last to conversations today.
Interesting. I'm a big fan of the Enlightenment for sure, all the time. I think Vincent.
It's your Roman Empire, Yeah. They say that men think about the Roman Empire every day. Have you heard that one?
Yep.
I didn't. You can tell us more.
Oh
if you
no,
want.
it's like a internet joke.
Okay, yeah.
But anyways, you think about the Enlightenment often.
Yeah, I do. What is the Enlightenment value?
Yeah. So I guess a bit of the sort of core values, as I kind of mentioned, I would say, are reason. So focusing on what can both be rationally and empirically and physically observed, as well as sort of ideas about mathematics, ideas about calculations, sort of, thinking of Sir Isaac Newton as one of the first Enlightenment scientists that really kind of kicked off, particularly like with really focusing on observation. And, I know we're going to get there in a little bit, but thinking about Charles Darwin, the conditions of the Enlightenment, the rationality made it possible for Darwin to take his journey and to go on his adventure that led to him understanding the theory of evolution. So that's one value. I think another important one is freedom. And that would be sort of the individual being the foundational sort of part of society, in the sense that, in the 17th and 18th century in Europe, there wasn't this concept of individualism and individual liberty, and certainly not, I think, for the average person. It wasn't a time of great agency. It wasn't a time of social mobility. There was sort of a burgeoning like mercantile middle class, but there wasn't much of an idea of an individual. And so the Enlightenment sort of proposed that the individual could have the autonomy. So that, I think that really brought, a really interesting aspect that led to democracy. So alongside that, of course, is this idea of freedom and equality. So, freedom of belief, freedom of association, and, equality under the law. But I think, again, it would probably, you'd have to put it into context because those things were not always realized. And, I think one of the ironies of the Enlightenment, for example, culminating in the French Revolution, it was Enlightenment ideas that were intended to challenge the, violence and sort of totalitarianism of the monarchy and the Roman Catholic Church. It led to such a bloody, violent revolution, and just so much violence and suffering ensued as an effect of these quote-unquote Enlightenment values that were meant to elevate the human being to break beyond the shackles of superstition and of inherited authority. And yet, the French Revolution shows that, well, it wasn't fully realized in that moment, and hopefully today we're able to draw a little bit closer to some of those ideas.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Next question is how the Enlightenment influenced the American Revolution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, the Enlightenment values, I feel like, are really quite so much wrapped up into what the American sort of mythos is, in the sense that, we, have this idea that each person has inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or someone might understand it, life, liberty, and property. So, the ability to acquire and build property, to, accumulate resources through different means of labor in a free market. And, Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, led to Thomas Jefferson, led to the framers of the Constitution. But before that, kind of, this movement to declare independence, to throw off the monarchy that was, extorting people through really high tax rates, and again, they had this narrative of seeking equality and of being enlightened people. Many of the founding fathers, were deists. They sort of had this sense that religion could be, shouldn't be a series of superstitions and institutions, but rather, would be centered on rationality. Kind of this idea that God, this notion of God, is that there's a watchmaker who makes the watch and then leaves the watch to continue turning, of its own accord. And why I say that is because I think, there was a very narrow group of people, obviously, who were, behind the Revolutionary War, and particularly, who it included and who it didn't include. So, it wasn't until the 20th century, first of all, it wasn't until after the Civil War that the horrific, barbaric institution of slavery was abolished, and then it wasn't until the 20th century that women began to be enfranchised. And so to say nothing of what it meant for the indigenous peoples in the United States, but nonetheless, these ideas, I think, really led to this Constitution that enshrined freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of association, which were honestly, really revolutionary ideas at the time. I think looking at the origins of the United States from the 13 colonies, it's clear that religious freedom wasn't fully realized. There was so much prejudice against, at that time, it was Protestant majority and there were Catholics as well. It wasn't the religiously diverse landscape, but at that time, Catholics were also not fully enfranchised even. And so, that was yet to be realized, even though in theory you had religious freedom. And of course, at the same time, people like George Washington, there are really interesting letters between him and Jewish communities, which were in the early, in the colonies in the United States. There are some really famous letters about him, sort of advancing the cause of the revolution and reaching out to some, congregations and synagogues and sort of explaining his interest in enshrining freedom of religion for them. So I guess, there was sort of a complicated story about what freedom would mean and what freedom of belief would mean. And of course, it remains that case today when you think about the role of religion and politics in America. Yeah.
And where Christian nationalism is metastasizing. I mean, I just can't let this one pass me by, but I just don't find that there is, and if you're the expert here, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't find there really to be much of concept of or use for freedom in religion, period. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's never any note, certainly in the Christian Bible, about, elections for who gets to be the leader of the religious whatever it is at the moment. I mean, this is kind of handed down from some authoritarian person or people who are the spokespeople for this God, and that's pretty much it. So I mean, I would not expect freedom of religion to come from any religion. Yeah. Really, as far as that goes.
I think you're right. I mean, at least as far as its origins go, and I think that's one thing that's really interesting, because in order to have freedom of religion, so I think of like the Second Vatican Council in the 20th century, which was, a council called by the Roman Catholic Church, by John the 23rd and then Paul the 6th, hierarchical, of course, de facto, but intended to respond to a modern world. And one of the ideas that it intended to respond to was, Enlightenment ideals of individual autonomy, individual freedom. And so after witnessing the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust, because this was the 1960s, not long after, the church said, we need to release teachings that show that, a totalitarian sense of religion and, doesn't protect people from violence, and this is not, the values that we want to have in the world. And so there was this idea that in the 1960s, through the Vatican Council's documents, religious freedom should be promoted. And, the authoritative teachings after the Second Vatican Council actually advocated for religious freedom and advocated for people to have the dignity to choose and to have kind of just societies regardless of religion, regardless of country, just societies where people could have freedom, have their basic needs met, and that religion would be a choice rather than a compulsion. And that sort of was how the Catholic Church wanted to see itself in the 20th century, after centuries of that not being the case. And so I say that because, while it's not really answering what you're saying, I think if the church wanted to be better, it needed to first be challenged by Enlightenment ideals. So in the sense that ideal didn't originate from a religious institution, it originated from, philosophy, and that entered eventually, after having witnessed so much war and death, in the name of religion or in the name of ideology, eventually that entered into this religious conscience, and somehow they synthesized it with theology. And so I think, it did not really it didn't start with organized religions by any means, but I think some of them have, in time kind of adopted some of these ideals, hopefully in the spirit of like human fraternity, of hopefully, ensuring that people have freedom of choice, because that's how people have come to understand, religion should function, which is less violent and more humane, at least in theory.
That answers the question quite well, actually. And I don't doubt that for a moment. That's, as far as I can see, that's a perfect example of a cultural evolution. Mm-hmm. Different strains of thought cross-pollinating, to use another metaphor, and changing each other, hopefully, for the better. I'm all for it.
Yeah. And at the same, and by that thread, I think, the cross-pollination, a way that, in spite of institutional, unilateral power and involvement in regimes and political weight of, we'll just go with the example of the Roman Catholic Church, it was for hundreds and hundreds of years and still today the world's largest philanthropic organization. So healthcare, hospitals, feeding people who are hungry, going as first responders into war zones. more than any other institution, there's a greater number who come from the Catholic Church. And so, not to eliminate all the other complications of history, but to say that's an area of interest in, cross-pollination, sort of where do these kind of ethics that are shared, that are universal, and maybe even only because of Enlightenment idea, I'm able to put together the sense that these are universal ethics, because that's kind of an Enlightenment ideal in and of itself, right? Like, we can see that we have this in common, even though, for some group it might originate in their scriptures. For someone, you might just say, I'm a rational thinking person. I can rationally see this is right and this is wrong, but nonetheless, the actions kind of align when it comes to social welfare.
Interesting.
Which kind of brings me back to something that sprang to mind earlier when you were talking about Enlightenment values. And you can say, well, reason and rationality are Enlightenment values indeed, but it's reason instead of.
Exactly.
That's where I'd like to hear a little bit more. For example, it's reason instead of revelation.
Exactly.
As I like to say, a humanist value is that we're going to determine what our ethics are based on observable effects on actual human beings, rather than what some revelation is written in a book.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big difference. There's not a lot of meeting of the minds possible there, because I'm really, I just don't have any use for revelation, except in an artistic sense. If you're talking to me about artistic revelation, I'm with you, brother. Or spiritual revelations of insights, self-actualization, all that yummy good stuff. I'm there for all of that. But that's still got to be bolted to the deck of reality by observation.
Right.
That's got to be the final say. And that's not what religion calls for. And or maybe I'm missing something there.
Well, I mean, that's a really interesting point. Can you tell me again, what did you say? You said reason, not revelation.
Right.
I think that's a great starting point, because I think that is an important part of Enlightenment thought.
Yeah.
And I think one area of many that influenced it, because, none of it was in a vacuum, right? Like philosophy, the scientific method as it began to be understood in the 15th, 16th, 17th, centuries, showed people how is an experiment conducted, how are natural phenomena observed, and that's in the same time period that they had the inklings of what we now understand to be germ theory, microbial life. And so that idea obviously influenced how the Enlightenment saw religion. And so, Enlightenment thinkers, some of whom, were not necessarily against religion as a whole, but rather were interested in making it rational. This idea that if we can't observe it in the natural world, then it is either not real, or maybe less extreme, not useful. And even today, like, I think of sometimes of like critical biblical scholarship, they say, did miracles happen? Did miracles not happen? It doesn't matter. Like, that's a thread that some kind of progressive biblical scholarship sees today. It's like, did this happen? Did it not happen? Even to the extent of like, did Jesus die and rise from the dead? There's sort of some theologians who say it doesn't matter, because what matters is the ethics and morals that the story teaches, which is really something interesting. But I think, to go back to the Enlightenment, what they wanted to show was, how can we take these ideas of supernatural, divine interactions in the world and see them through a rational way. And then I think that's kind of what led to ideas about, universal ethics, universal tendency of what's right and what's wrong. Like, that rationally, there has to be that in no culture it's acceptable to murder someone. That's a universal thing that we don't need religion to tell us. And that's maybe a theory. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not true. Certainly, individual people do commit murder, and always have and always will. But
definition of murder is very important.
Also true.
I've read accounts of indigenous societies that were at least recent enough so that these accounts were taken from first person
Yeah.
What was it? A woman interviewed about
Yeah.
her married life, and it was like she'd had 4 husbands.
Oh, yeah.
And, each one was killed
Yeah.
by the next husband,
Yeah.
who then took her as his wife. And in nowhere in that interview, I don't really remember all of that interview, but in no point in that interview was there anything about,
Yeah.
well, my third husband, he had to run because they were after him for murder. So at least it was implied that this
Wow.
kind of, marital, whatever you want to call it, was at least expected
Wow.
in that culture.
Right.
You know what I'm
Right,
saying?
and
So,
power
I mean,
power
what
was
is
a higher
murder?
value than morality. Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
Yeah. We would like to go back to the Enlightenment, actually.
Yeah.
How did the Enlightenment affect Christianity, and how Christianity affect the Enlightenment?
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, I think the really important context is that before the Enlightenment, you had all these religious wars in Europe between the Catholics and the Protestants that were incredibly bloody on the continent. In Great Britain, just incredible, violent decades of wars among the Catholic Church and Protestant churches, and that was sort of the context from which the Enlightenment emerged. And so, how did it affect Christianity? Well, initially, I would say, Christianity was deeply threatened by it. The institutions were deeply, threatened by the Enlightenment ideals. One which put the human individual as kind of the center of ethics and morality and of meaning, which was very different from what Christian theology was teaching. 2, I think this idea, of course, again, of challenging authority for authority's sake, became quickly, is sort of when you begin to challenge authorities for authority's sake, and that's something that is sort of an unstoppable train when it comes to how an institution is threatened. And so, and the same was true for many Protestant churches as well. The same was true for Calvinists, for example, in Switzerland. And, this idea that divine revelation could be called into question really undermined a lot of how they saw Scripture, how they saw, faith, how they saw God and the Holy Trinity in the world. And so I think it was very threatening for a very long time to Christianity. And, I don't know exactly. It would be very interesting to see how it affected, attendance at church, for example, because I just don't know. But I do know that it did definitely seriously threaten, religious authorities, and, to the extent where, it wasn't really until, the late 19th and earliest 20th century that the Roman Catholic Church, so, centuries later, it wasn't until then that the Roman Catholic Church could kind of begin to accept some of the teachings of the Enlightenment. So, for example, this idea that a society could be secular, that you could have a society that had separation of church and state. So, I don't think it was, and I could be mistaken, so this might be something to look up and add later. I think it was Pope Pius, but it might have been the previous Pope Leo, but I want to say around the turn of the 1900s is when finally they sort of promulgated some kind of teaching that said, we can have freedom of religion, we can have a secular government, and, religion and state don't have to go hand in hand in order to feel like, we're living in a society that's true to our Christian values. And so this idea that you could be, a member of the institutional church and be in a secular society was something that the Vatican really ignored for centuries, until finally addressing much later. And so I think that's one stream. And then eventually, which really started with Protestant theologians, but also, later Catholic theologians, this idea of biblical textual criticism. And so, applying theories of literary critique, archaeology, anthropology to how people understood the Bible was something that the Enlightenment opened the door to, which is kind of still really dominant in the field of biblical studies today, including also in Jewish community, in the Jewish community, how Bible is studied as well, how Tanakh is studied, how the Torah, the writings and the prophets are studied, which are also part of the Christian scriptures. That's also sort of a conversation, even including in more liberal streams of orthodoxy. It's kind of a debate about, how do you read the scriptures? And what sort of theories of modern criticism can you apply to those texts? And how do you bring in sort of science or archaeology, or just, continual ways that we understand texts? How do you bring it to these really ancient scriptures, especially when, people have different levels of authority that they afford to the scriptures? And so I think all of that is sort of a product of the Enlightenment. So I think it is a bit of a complicated story, although I would say that I think, it led to a wider and richer sort of intellectual tradition that eventually, average lay people could access in Christianity, but obviously qualified, because I don't think that's universally so. But over time, I think that is what the Enlightenment sort of opened the door to. And today it's not, today you have different issues and challenges, but I think some of those initial worries about the Enlightenment are no longer sort of front and center for religious institutions. In the same way, I mean, as central, fewer Christian groups are threatened by critiques of biblical literalism than in the past.
But what about the emphasis on reason versus revelation? I mean, there's just some things I don't see how they cannot be threatened by.
Yeah, no, sure.
We were saying, I'm sorry, folks, but the basis of your entire intellectual and devotional system here is bad.
Yeah. Sure. Oh yeah. I mean, it's again,
how do you?
What are miracles? So a definition of a miracle is, God breaking in or divine power breaking in and doing something very different than what can be physically, scientifically observed. Violating the laws of gravity, for example. Right. Changing time, bending space and time. And I think those things are not really compatible with so much of rationalist philosophy. And so, it's a huge
not without
tension.
evidence.
Not without evidence, but I don't think
you have to give me something.
We haven't got much good evidence for anything miraculous, right? And that's...
I looked, too.
Yeah.
I mean, something you had said earlier about how do we interpret the supernatural in rational terms. That's it. Interpret the supernatural in rational terms. I actually was able to come to an accommodation, an intellectual and emotional accommodation to that at some point in my mid-20s. I was studying ceremonial magic and Kabbalah and alchemy and paganism and all of the, we were doing Santeria rituals. All of this stuff was going on. I've seen Orishas possess people. Mm-hmm. I've seen, all kinds of, quote unquote supernatural things, really experiences that, a few hundred years prior, without any rational frame of reference to judge them by, I would have had to say that this was something supernatural. And at this point, I see all of those events. I'm certainly not going to say that they didn't happen. I think they actually happened. There's something. And it was basically, we have this very narrow little band of what we can see, what we can hear, what we can touch, our little bandwidth that we have. And then every once in a while, particularly if you get yourself into an altered state, very common among religious and similar practices, you get yourself into an altered state, and now you're capable of briefly apprehending some of that other stuff.
Right.
Whatever that is.
Right.
So I'm happy to not just concede, but say on the basis of experience, oh my goodness, revelation. What was his name? Locke says it's necessarily, anecdotal. Okay, well, there you go. A piece of anecdotal evidence that our brains, that satisfies me that our brains can do some really remarkable stuff
Yeah.
without having to fall back on anything supernatural,
Yeah.
which I actually think at this point is weirder than anything supernatural.
Yeah,
to
but
be
that's
quite honest
interesting.
with you, I mean, the science. I was very scientifically illiterate at the time, and was quite taken with a bunch of these mythologies, etc. But then you start reading about and learning about science, and you realize the richness of that. Call it a mythology,
Yeah.
just for a moment. The richness of that story, those stories, is exponentially greater than than what we can come up with just out of our own little minds. Anyway, that's been my accommodation with that, because man, I've experienced some pretty wacky stuff.
Yeah. I find that so interesting, and I certainly find those experiences very interesting. Perhaps it's another conversation, but
Another conversation, and maybe another
Fascinating.
podcast in the not too
Absolutely.
distant
Absolutely.
future.
I do have another question
Please.
also. How did the Enlightenment influence Darwin? When
Yeah.
you also mentioned earlier about that Catholic Church understood Darwinism differently than now. So if
Yeah.
you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I studied environmental science in undergrad, and I think the story of Darwin was always something I found really cool and exciting. His journey on the SS Beagle to the Galapagos, I always wanted to go there. And just the way he writes is incredible. It's you can see that he's in awe. What he wrote 200 years ago, in his diaries, you can see that he's in awe of the sights, the sounds, the colors, the incredible biodiversity, and writes so beautifully and lovingly almost about these birds he sees and the tortoises. Those are two of the very famous cases, and with the birds you have this very famous case that they maybe you're familiar with it, but he observed how each bird had tiny nuances among them. There were the birds with the fat beaks that could break nuts, and that had the anatomy and the strong enough jaw to be able to break these nuts. And there were the birds with the tiny straw-like beaks that could penetrate the ground and pull out an insect. There were the woodpeckers or something similar that had a straight beak that could break into the wood and again get food that way. And he looked at these birds that were otherwise very similar and had these slight nuances among them, and he was really in awe. And I think that's something that people don't always know. I think the whole thing about evolution and Darwin, I feel like it's been very polemicized. There's a lot of religious fundamentalists who are really against evolution, right?
Right.
You've noticed.
I've noticed. but I think it's really beautiful what he wrote. But the Enlightenment, this idea of how do we observe the natural world? How do we understand reality? Those kinds of questions. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a human alongside millions of non-human species? Are humans unique among the species? Are we humans and animals, or are humans animals? And I think Darwin's expedition is bringing those questions, to modernity, and is a hugely important part of that. And yeah, so I loved reading about his voyages.
Yeah.
And, he really took serious this kind of, inquiry, deep inquiry, questions and observations and obtaining evidence and thousands of specimens that he brought back to England. And this is what he used to formulate the beginnings of his theory of evolution, that all of these life forms, had a common ancestor, and that the origin of species, the origin of life, was from a common origin point. And, each branch of life split off, and there's vast differences between certain species and very small differences between others. And it sort of gave him this idea using observation, using rational thought to extrapolate how life is connected. And, Darwin's work and understanding evolution, understanding sort of the all of these thoughts about how and when life came to be, and how and when different life forms split off and evolved, do threaten the question of what is a human being for many people, right? A philosophical question of, is a human different from the other animals? Which is interesting, actually, because, that's sort of a different direction from a lot of Enlightenment thought, because the Enlightenment thought and sort of the humanism of the Renaissance that came before it really put humans at the center. Even if it pushed God out of the picture, it put humans at the center. And then I think, with the 19th century work of Darwin, and then, of course, the ensuing decades of scientific discovery and theorizing and sort of reformulating how we understand the biodiversity, and still today we're kind of constantly in the scientific method really still learning different things and challenging previous assumptions about where did life forms evolve from and how and when and where. But I think that sort of brings a different question today about what does it mean to be a human in light of the Enlightenment and in light of scientific discovery and theories like the theory of evolution. So I think that that's a really interesting question.
Thank you. I would like to know how the Catholic Church accept evolution at the same time and mix it with Christianity.
Yeah.
How they put those two things in a blender and mix it together and give it back to people.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that people don't always know is the Vatican has some of the best astronomers in the world. The Vatican Observatory is renowned throughout the world, and they've really always invested in scientific discovery, even as there's been an authoritarian sort of emphasis to Catholic polity and to how dioceses are structured and how the global Catholic Church is structured. There's always been some kind of investment in science, especially from the Vatican. And so I think, so initially there's this hostility towards evolution, towards the theory of evolution, because it questions, again, what does it mean to be a human?
Yeah.
But also more importantly, it questions creation. Like, is there intelligent design? Is there a creator? Which is why, many people of faith and many religious authorities across religions, have been threatened by, Darwin and the theory of evolution. But, in the 20th century and beyond, there was some really interesting Catholic intellectuals and theologians and philosophers who sort of saw evolution not as evidence against intelligent design, but sort of evidence for it because of its complexity and because of the way that life forms were interconnected and because of the sort of historic ancient character of life, being hundreds of millions of years old, and before that Earth having an evolving atmosphere and evolving elements for hundreds and hundreds of millions of years. To contemporary theologians, I think they saw that as a question of, not of, is there a creator, is there a loving God, but they said that there still can be, and this is like a mechanism of creation. I mean, and for me, as a Jew, I find that almost more compelling to say that these are mechanisms that we can't even understand. There are hundreds of millions of species we don't even know. Bugs, bacteria, the deep sea we don't know much about. And the theory of evolution, that there's millions and millions of species that have evolved over millions and millions of years, it feels like greater evidence that there's sort of a divine plan than a few pages in the book of Genesis are.
Yeah.
I think to say, the world is only 6,000 years old and that's it. That's like putting a very finite limit on what is God, instead of saying, look at this tremendous scientific discovery that we continue to make. And I mean, how beautiful, each cell is. and how complex and how crazy the whole, history of how life evolved is. So for me, I guess I can see where that's coming from, and I can see how people could, at least that aspect, synthesize with religion.
Interesting. We have a couple, few minutes to end up, and I would like to talk about Judaism and how did the Enlightenment affect Judaism, especially that I'm studying Judaism, and my Hebrew name, maybe Humanist Foundation doesn't know yet about Simcha, which I met Kyle, and which interesting to see also the world and the history through Judaism about what's happened in Middle East and Europe and Holocaust and all of that things, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, it's to keep it focused on the Enlightenment. I think the Enlightenment in Judaism has really led us to a couple of really interesting things. We were talking before the show about Moses Mendelssohn, the father of the Reform movement in Judaism, who was, from 18th century Germany. And one really interesting thing about Rabbi Mendelssohn is that he grew up in poverty, abject poverty. He was self-taught. He educated himself. And at that time, there were not, denominations within Judaism. There were rabbis, there were rabbinical courts, there were, legal authorities, like in terms of Jewish law. And some people were religious, some people were less religious. Some people didn't really care about religion, but there was sort of only one institution. And, there were synagogues in Morocco and synagogues in Yemen and synagogues in Germany and synagogues in Russia who had different customs and different practices and different traditions, but they were, they weren't split into different sects. And so Mendelssohn was responding to this Enlightenment idea of rationalism, of empiricism. So he had this idea of making Judaism seen as a science. And, before the Holocaust, Germany emancipated the Jewish community, giving them full rights as citizens. Of course, violence and prejudice persisted, but at that time, universities were open to Jews, which hadn't been the case in Germany, and of course wouldn't be in the years before the Holocaust as Nazism came. But it was a time in which German Jews were integrating more, at least within some parameters and in some spaces. And Mendelssohn saw it as an opportunity to look at how there were ideas about sort of universalism, universal kind of fraternity of humankind, rationalism that, ethics and morals should be based in things we can rationally observe, and, freedom of the individual and freedom of belief. And so he thought that, making Judaism scientific would kind of serve two purposes, I think. One, sort of protect the Jewish community by showing German society that German Jews could be just like Germans. They could speak German rather than Yiddish. They could cut their payos and look just like German people. They could go to universities just like Germans. And it wasn't necessarily that Reform Judaism never rejected God, but it said we see this in a rational way. We see creation in a rational way, and we see Jewish law, halacha, as something in which we're going to take the ethical teachings and the moral teachings, but the laws that we can't give a rational basis for, such as keeping your side locks, we're not going to obligate people to do anymore. And that also can include like the laws of kosher. And so a lot of the early reform thinkers, really kind of said we don't want to keep kosher either, although that would sort of come back in the reform movement in the end. But this idea was that how do we make Judaism rational? So they brought organs into the synagogue. And, traditionally in Jewish law, you don't have instruments on Shabbat because if an instrument breaks, you're tempted to repair it, and then you would be doing work. And so there's no instruments in the synagogue on Shabbat, but the Reform rabbi said, no, we're going to bring in organs just like they have in the churches. And sort of one of the criticisms that people had was that this was trying to assimilate too much, that it was modeling itself off of the Christian churches in Germany, with organs and stained glass windows and sermons, and they looked at it and they said, we're assimilating too much. And, there was sort of a response by some in the Orthodox community that sort of led to what we see now as ultra-Orthodoxy, that really kind of said, no, we need to withdraw completely from secular society, including, fellow Jews who wanted to push assimilation. And I think at the same time, it was also seen as a way so at the same time it was seen as Moses Mendelssohn thought it would sort of protect the Jewish community, integrate them into German society, sort of given them political, economic opportunities they didn't have before. I think it was also seen as something that was totally supposed to be positive internal to the Jewish community too, like to give religion meaning, to give it a rational basis, to focus on learning and knowledge and ethics and morals rather than laws that, didn't have a rational explanation, such as laws of kosher, what to eat and what not to eat, and instead focusing on ethical laws, charity and service, etc. And so that was sort of, I think, what the Enlightenment had to say about Judaism and how it impacted it, and one of the other interesting, I think, pieces of Enlightenment history, kind of to go back to the French Revolution aimed, in theory, to create equality among people, to abolish hierarchy, get rid of the church, get rid of the monarchy, liberate the masses, and, emancipate Jews, make them citizens, make France a society where religion doesn't matter whether you're a citizen or not. But, that part of the French Revolution, which in and of itself was bloody towards the church, towards monks and nuns, and towards, people who were involved in the church, even if they weren't in power, it also, I think, it didn't get rid of hostility in French society towards the Jewish community. And, it kind of presented French Jews with the question of, you either assimilate into French society or, you're going to face discrimination and violence. And so there was this kind of tension among the Jewish community after the Enlightenment about, do you assimilate? Do you hold steadfast? There wasn't so much of an option in Germany and France to say, you can be a religious Jew and you can live in your own community and you can maintain your way of life and you can be a full citizen. Yeah. I think France had a more extreme case of really very anti-Semitic society, whereas in Germany, there was sort of this movement from within the Jewish community to respond to the Enlightenment by promoting rationalism, by promoting assimilating in some capacity. But really what they intended to do was to say we can remain true to our Jewish identity and also be citizens of this country we live in. And of course, in the case of Germany, it's a great tragedy that didn't prevent the Holocaust from happening, and so it's very sad. And for me, I think about the Enlightenment and the origins of Reform Judaism, and I think it's really amazing the intellectual tradition it brought to Judaism and democratization. Brought the first female rabbis. Yeah. Before the World War II, before the Holocaust, right. They had the first female rabbis.
Interesting.
And yet all of that, yeah. They couldn't have foreseen the horrors of the Holocaust.
Interesting. I'm thinking a lot about reform movement in Germany, 200 years, Hashkeveno, and being secular also at the same time. Very beautiful. We run on time and we had a really great conversation with you, Kyle. We would like to talk about being gay and also part of Orthodox Judaism. If you don't mind, we have just a few minutes. Okay. And what is your message to Humanist Foundation?
Okay.
In 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. I know I can talk for a long time, so hopefully it was coherent enough for you and for your listeners. Okay, so about me, I very hard question. I'm more than happy to answer it. I guess first and foremost, my connection to my religion and spirituality is one where, I'm connected to the divine. I feel spiritually connected. I feel ethically bound. And, I feel this sense of divine love that inspires me to, hopefully, with the help of God, be a better person, have compassion, forgiveness, fight for justice, try to be patient, try to be gentle, try to be generous. And that, for me, it's like the stronger my spiritual connection is, the more time I focus into learning, meditating, praying, I feel myself ethically and morally become stronger and kind of convict myself for my faults and purify myself, and I'm not saying that I'm perfect. I'm not even close, but I'm saying it helps me. I really need it.
You got a process you're working it.
Yeah.
Applied philosophy.
That's it. That's it. That's exactly it. And so for me, it's like, that's what's fundamental. And, why Orthodoxy? I love the tradition, the history of it. And Orthodoxy gives you these physical rituals, like you're putting on tefillin.
Yeah.
Like you're keeping kosher. And again, I don't think keeping kosher is rational. But I do it because keeping kosher, it's a conscious decision every time you put something in your body. You say, I'm going to put this in my body. I'm not going to put this in my body. I'm going to be mindful every time I eat. If I'm going to be so mindful about what I'm eating and what I'm mixing and how I'm cooking it, then I should be so much more mindful about how I treat other human beings and other life forms, animals. And I've, thankfully living in New York City, I have a community where I can be out and I can be myself.
Nice.
That's not the case for so many people.
Yeah.
Which is really, really sad. And, my partner, he's Jewish, but, and he loves this journey for me and he supports me. He's not religious per se, but he's, spiritual. And he says, well, I always say to him, I guess, really, I'm like, why should I let these people who are homophobic take me out of religion? Why should I let them say you can't have religion and spirituality?
I love that.
I want that. I believe in it. It's a part of who I am. So I can't let them push me out, and they win. So it's not easy. But it's beautiful, and I really feel a strong passion to build bridges. To say one person's an atheist, one person's Jewish, one person's Muslim, one person's Christian, Hindu. It doesn't matter. We can come to a table and we can find so much common ground and just in terms of how we love each other, how we love our families, how we want the world to be better. And that's such an important thing for me to just see the human divine spark in every person.
Yeah.
So that's a huge honor to be on this show.
Oh, it's an honor to have you, actually, Kyle. We had a really good conversation, and we would like to thank you for being here.
Really.
Thank you, Vincent Downing.
Okay.
Oh,
Well, thank you
yeah.
so much for having me. And just my message to the Humanist Foundation is, continue to educate people and bring them together to ask serious and hard questions. And I wish you well as you continue on this journey of trying to ask questions, because that's sometimes what matters more than having the answer.
Yeah. Oh, thank you,
Thank you.
Kyle Levine.